We begin tonight with a collapse, not a negotiation that stalled, not a summit that ended without agreement, not a tariff dispute that ground into another cycle of diplomatic correspondence. A collapse, sudden, structural, and witnessed in real time by every government, every market, and every allied partner that had been watching the most consequential trade confrontation of the 21st century build toward what Washington had promised would be its decisive moment. The President of the United States had threatened a 50% tariff on all Canadian imports. Not a targeted measure, not a sector-specific correction, a blanket 50% tariff, the kind of number that, if implemented, would have restructured the largest bilateral trading relationship on Earth overnight, eliminating the economic logic of 3 decades of integrated supply chains in a single administrative action. Washington had presented it as the ultimatum that would end the standoff, the number that Canada could not absorb, the pressure that would finally bring Ottawa back to the table on American terms. For 11 days, every analyst, every market participant, and every allied government had been waiting to see how Canada would respond. No press conference preceded what came next, no ministerial statement, no carefully worded communiqué released through the Department of Foreign Affairs. Just a single action executed in 4 hours across 3 capitals that rendered the 50% tariff threat not just ineffective, but structurally irrelevant. And then Mark Carney walked to a podium and said 7 words that the world had not been prepared for. 7 words that answered the largest tariff threat in the history of the bilateral relationship. Not with a counter-threat, not with a legal challenge, not with an emergency appeal to the WTO, but with a statement of fact so precise and so devastating that Washington has not recovered its footing since. Those 7 words are, "The threat only works if we need you." To understand why those 7 words detonated with the force they did, why markets moved $900 billion in combined valuation in the 72 hours that followed, you have to understand what the 50% tariff threat was actually designed to do, and why it was designed to do it at this particular moment. The United States and Canada conduct $480 billion in annual bilateral trade, a relationship that the Bureau of Economic Analysis credits with sustaining 389,000 American jobs. But behind that $480 billion number sits a structural reality that the American administration had been relying on since the confrontation began. Canada, for all its diplomatic restraint and strategic patience, appeared to depend on American market access in ways that made the threat of that access being removed the most powerful tool Washington held. Canadian energy exports, $112 billion annually, flowed primarily southward into American refineries and grid infrastructure. Canadian automotive components, representing 34% of inputs in American assembled vehicles, crossed the border under supply chain architectures that American manufacturers had spent decades building around Canadian participation. Canadian agricultural producers sold $23 billion annually into American markets under tariff arrangements that Canadian farming communities in Ontario, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan had planned their entire economic future around. The 50% tariff was designed to make all of that feel suddenly, catastrophically fragile. It was designed to make the cost of Canadian independence, the cost of Carney's 16 months of restraint and strategic diversification, feel larger than any Canadian government could ask its citizens to bear. It was, in the assessment of 2 former American trade negotiators who spoke on background to major financial publications, the nuclear option. The thing you deploy when you want the other side to understand that the alternative to your terms is economic destruction. Washington deployed it, and Canada answered in 4 hours. The Canadian response was not improvised, and it was not reactive. And that distinction is the most important structural fact of this entire episode. For 9 weeks prior to the 50% tariff announcement, the Canadian government had been executing a preparation so methodical, so precisely sequenced, and so carefully concealed from public view that even its own allied partners did not know its full scope until the moment of activation. The preparation had 3 components. The first was financial architecture. Working with the Bank of Canada and a consortium of 7 sovereign wealth funds, including funds from Norway, Singapore, Abu Dhabi, and Qatar, Canada had established a $340 billion bilateral trade liquidity mechanism designed to allow Canadian exporters to redirect product flows to non-American buyers within 96 hours of activation using pre-arranged currency swap arrangements that bypassed dollar-denominated settlement entirely. The mechanism had been stress-tested twice in the 9 weeks preceding the tariff announcement, and both tests had confirmed that it could handle the full volume of redirected Canadian export flows without triggering the liquidity crises that conventional economic modeling predicted as the consequence of sudden bilateral trade disruption. The second component was market redirection. Canada had spent those 9 weeks finalizing destination agreements with buyers in the European Union, Japan, India, South Korea, and the United Arab Emirates. Agreements that covered $287 billion in annual Canadian export capacity across energy, agricultural products, critical minerals, and manufactured goods. Not framework documents, signed purchase agreements with pricing, with logistics arrangements, with activation timelines. The EU alone had committed to absorbing $94 billion in Canadian energy and agricultural exports under 10-year supply contracts that offered Canadian producers prices between 11% and 19% above prevailing American market rates. Japan had committed to $61 billion in Canadian critical mineral supply under 15-year contracts. India had committed to $43 billion in Canadian agricultural and pharmaceutical exports. The UAE had committed to $31 billion Canadian LNG under arrangements that had been quietly negotiated through back channels for 7 months. The third component was the Domestic Stabilization Fund, a $78 billion Federal Reserve mechanism designed to support Canadian industries during the transition period, providing bridge financing to producers whose revenue would be interrupted by the redirection of export flows during the first 18 months of implementation. The fund had been capitalized in advance approved by Parliament under emergency budget provisions and was ready to deploy within 24 hours of activation. When the 50% tariff threat was issued, Canada did not call an emergency cabinet meeting. The emergency cabinet meeting had already happened 3 weeks earlier when the final activation protocols were approved. What happened when the tariff threat landed was not a scramble. It was an execution. The activation took 4 hours and 17 minutes. At 9:14 a.m. Ottawa time, the Bank of Canada formally activated the bilateral trade liquidity mechanism, notifying the 7 sovereign wealth fund partners that Canadian export redirection was commencing. At 10:31 a.m., the Department of Foreign Affairs issued simultaneous formal notifications to the EU, Japan, India, South Korea, and the UAE that Canada was activating its pre-signed purchase agreements effective immediately. At 11:47 a.m., the Minister of Finance,